The West really is in great need of defense, but only against itself and its own tendencies, which, if they are pushed to their conclusion, will lead inevitably to its ruin and destruction. The crisis of the modern world is this, that progress will eventually destroy us, more than likely by the hands of the very ideal itself. The birth pangs of this destruction were first felt in the beginning of the modern era, and in our time they are more vigorous than ever before. This sense of impending doom felt by our society is expressed in a myriad of ways, from the rise of what was once an extremely niche science fiction genre becoming popular with the masses in dystopian television shows like The Walking Dead or Black Mirror, to the increasingly fatalistic shock tactics being employed by YouTube thumbnails and titles to attract viewers. It takes only minutes of listening to Fox News or CNN to hear about the ways in which our world is on the brink of destruction. And if you live in rural America, like I do, a quick chat with the local grocery store cashier or gas attendant will likely lead to a lively conversation about doomsday prepping and living off the land. Even within the church, the last 40 years has seen the rise of best-selling apocalyptic fiction like the Left Behind series, and an innumerable amount of terrible Christian B movies about end times attempting to ride the wave that was created in the wake of that series' success, and the ever-increasing amount of churches in the United States with prophecy updates. This sense of doom is acknowledged at this point and recognized by almost everyone. Rene, Guenon, a French traditionalist from the modern era, wrote a book in 1927, which I just quoted in the introduction, titled The Crisis of the Modern World, in which he responds to what he sees as the philosophical and spiritual dilemma of modernism. In this book, Guenon claims that we are nearing the end of the Kali Yuga, the Hindu version of the apocalypse. It is the fourth and final yuga in a cycle of 4 yugas, or world ages, a concept that runs against what we are generally taught about how history works in public schools in the United States, where our textbooks are filled with progressive conceptions of history, what is generally termed Whig history. Plato, for example, in the Republic references cyclical governance of societies and breaks them down into 4 categories: timocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny. Aristotle then riffs on this idea in the Politics with a differing order, but with the same general concept of history. This conception of history as a cycle that has a rise and a fall can be found throughout most of the ancient and medieval writers of the Western world, but it is also found in some more contemporary writers, though they are mostly on the outskirts of common knowledge. It is not until the Enlightenment that the more common progressive conceptions of history begin to surface. The general idea that we are taught growing up is that society has been progressing since the age of the caveman, that we used to go about banging on drums, grunting a fair amount, and murdering our neighbors in furious outbursts of alpha male euphoria. But somewhere along the line, through a progressive evolutionary process, we advanced into the contemplative, morally upright, gentle, and kind creatures of today. That we came from barbarism, and from then to now we have progressed into highly intellectual and sophisticated beings. Interestingly, this is a completely modern conception of history. It is unsurprising then that progress is an idea that is directly tied to evolutionism and naturalism. In a progressive worldview that is focused on what is new as better than what came before, as is the case with the Enlightenment theorists in their naturalistic worldview of constant becoming, there is no room for the metaphysical or what lies outside of the naturalistic world as stable and constant eternal principles, which adds some interesting nuance to my previous video speaking about postmodern aesthetics when evaluating absolute truth compared to relativism. Absolute truth being the constant and eternal principles that never change outside of man, and relativism only that which is constantly changing in a purely material world of becoming, as is beautifully articulated by Heraclitus in his fragments. Unsurprising then that Heraclitus perceived the existence of relativity from his observations of the natural world. But to the modern world, the material world is all that exists. There is no eternal, no spiritual, no metaphysical, only that which can be seen and touched. To quote Guenon, it seems that nothing exists for modern men beyond what can be seen and touched, or at least even if they admit theoretically that something more may exist, they immediately declare it not merely unknown, but unknowable, which absolves them from having to think about it. In the traditional sciences before, our understanding stood on the foundation of metaphysical principles, but we have removed those and focused specifically on the material side of things. We have redirected our focus to the detailed accumulation of knowledge about the material world through the sciences, and for what reason? To better understand higher truths, as was previously the case, to contemplate the beauty of God's creation, the initial purpose of scientists like Isaac Newton or Blaise Pascal? Sadly, no. only to employ this wealth of knowledge in the development of material things that make life more convenient for us. And to what does all of this scientific progress contribute to? According to Guenon, it is a change that is the direct opposite of progress, amounting indeed to a veritable regression of intelligence. And I think we can all attest to this. IQs are not going up, and there are more and more people taking this problem more seriously every year that passes, as we come face to face with serious issues that must be addressed for the sake of the future of Western culture. Technology provides more readily available knowledge to all mankind, but asks less of man with every step that it takes into the future. I think that this is very well exemplified in something like the power of AI to write a paper. It simplifies the process for us and does it fairly well, but if there's no need to write because AI does it for us, we will come to simply rely on it, the way that we do a calculator for mathematical computing or a Google search for the accumulation of information. This is the case with something like retention as well, our memory. Because technology through the internet has opened the gates to any and every fact available to man and is immediately accessible to anyone and everyone, there is less reason to retain the information. The internet becomes a sort of extension of our brain in that way, but as technology simplifies our access to information, we become less dependent on our intellectual ability to retain and access information in memory. I have a personal experience of how this works. I play the guitar and sing. When I was younger, I memorized all of the songs that I sang, and because of that, I was able to sing them anytime, and was actually able to experiment with them quite a bit, and was unbound with my interpretation of them because I knew them so well. Over time, to facilitate the process though, I began reading chords and lyrics online. I then became dependent on them, so that now when I sit down with a guitar and I have no sheet music, I'm at a complete loss of what to play. This is what I'm getting at with technology and its effects on retention, but that is only a small part of this vastly complex issue. In this book, Guenon, through different iterations and examples, expounds on the ways the modern world has flipped everything upside down on its head. It has placed man before God, the material before the spiritual, pleasure before duty, the individual before the community, and anarchy before authority. To quote Guenon, "Nothing and nobody is any longer in the right place. Men no longer recognize any effective authority in the spiritual order or any legitimate power in the temporal. The profane presume to discuss what is sacred and to contest its character and even its existence. The inferior judges the superior. Ignorance sets bounds to wisdom. Error prevails over truth. The human is substituted for the divine. Earth has priority over heaven." The individualistic and humanist perspective of the modern West places the focal point on man's authenticity. Man strives in all that he does, whether art, science, or philosophy, to be the first, a creator of an original idea, thus portraying to the world his authenticity as a true individual. Guenon explains how this is but a meaningless fantasy in an individualistic world, that truth and true ideas belong to all men, that truth is not the product of the human mind, but that it exists independently of us as an eternal principle. Like many who critique modernism, Guenon sees the Reformation in the Church as a pivotal point in the deviation of the West towards this individualistic perspective. Consider this quote: "Individualism necessarily implies the refusal to accept any authority higher than the individual, as well as any means of knowledge higher than individual reason. The implications of which are apparent in the Reformation, as the Reformers questioned the authority of the Catholic Church and effectively brought the final authority of biblical interpretation down to the level of each individual through sola scriptura. I would make the argument, however, that they were retrieving a previous biblical culture in the early church and placing the final authority in the written word of God, not that of a human institution or that of the individual. Even so, I think it is obvious that it has a direct corollary to the modern individualistic world. This can be seen in modern Protestantism, where Christian belief has split into thousands of individualistic denominations, where you can choose whichever one fits you personally. And heck, if you prefer a slightly different denomination, just start your own." Guenon's critiques on religion in the modern world are piercingly accurate to the world today. Quote, "The state of mind we are referring to is primarily one that consists, so to speak, in minimizing religion and treating it as something to be kept on one side and relegated to as limited and narrow a field as possible, so that it remains completely fenced off with no real influence on the rest of existence. Secularism has had us divide our spiritual lives from our day-to-day lives, so that we have moved belief into something that is not central to our existence, but only something that is maintained on the side, because it does not in any way pertain to the material world in a way that is quantifiable or determinable by the study of a science. Metaphysics has become a laughable subject in the West, and spirituality is not taken seriously in almost any form except when it is completely personal and practiced only on Sundays. This is tremendously accurate when considering the modern state of Christianity in our world today, where Christians are generally indistinguishable from the secularists. His critique on equality also shines light into our society. Guenon claims that equality is a pseudo-principle because it does not actually exist, that it is a logical fallacy to believe that two beings can be at the same time completely distinct from each other, yet completely alike in every way, that fitting all of humanity into a precise uniformity is an impossible task. Do all people learn the same things the same way that warrants a uniform education? Are all people capable of understanding the same things? Even if my resume is the same as another person in every respect, are we both equally qualified for the job? Quote, "It must be noticed that not merely does a man in the present state of affairs fulfill his proper function only in exceptional cases and as though by accident, but it also happens that the same man is called upon to fulfill successively completely different functions, as though he could change his aptitudes at will." He also critiques democracy and articulates that the greatest error in democracy is simply this, that a man cannot be ruler and ruled at the same time. The vilest trick that is played on a democratic society is that it is being constantly told that the individual has the freedom and the power to choose, when truly it is the work of others in power guiding society to choose what it has determined for them to choose. Public opinion is very easily guided and modified to whichever end the beneficiary desires, and the majority leading the society is always incompetent to choose based off of a greater knowledge. They believe whatever the societal hive mind reverberates to them and vote thus. The opinion of the majority cannot be anything but an expression of incompetence, whether this be due to lack of intelligence or to ignorance pure and simple. Certain observations of mass psychology might be quoted here. In particular, the widely known fact that the aggregate of mental reactions aroused among the competent individuals of a crowd crystallizes into a sort of general psychosis, whose level is not merely not that of average, but actually of the lowest elements present. As I just read Dostoevsky's Demons this last year, I still have this vivid image from that book of the masses being like the swine that Jesus casts the demons into, and they destroy themselves by drowning in the sea. Without expounding too much on Dostoevsky, he shows through this marvelous classic that ideas are like demons in the masses, causing a frightening mass psychosis, and they are planted there by someone. We can be sure of that. The idea of the elite is something that democracy despises. This is why it hates authority. Democracy has power in numbers, and the aristocracy has power in its few intellectually superior elites. The democracy ultimately sacrifices the few to favor the many, and likewise sacrifices quality for quantity. Quote, "The very foundation of the democratic idea is the supposition that one individual is as good as another, simply because they are equal numerically, and in spite of the fact that they can never be equal in any other way. Equality is in fact impossible. And since, despite all efforts toward leveling, the differences between one man and another cannot in practice be entirely suppressed. Progress and modernity have destroyed our spirituality and made us rely too heavily on the material things of this earth. It has robbed man of any transcendental substance and replaced it with simple amenities and conveniences. It is no accident that in the wake of the Enlightenment there is a rise in nihilism. Guenon argues that our pursuit of science is simple pragmatism that justifies industry, that we pursue with all our strength the development of new technologies to dominate the material world and bend it to our will, the result of which is sickly ironic, and that we have done nothing but enslave ourselves to materialism in this pursuit. Our jobs for the sake of this behemoth progress are menial and impersonal, and we perform repetitive tasks like machines. The object of our progress is to merely produce as much as we possibly can, quality be damned. The modern West cannot tolerate that men should prefer to work less and be content to live on little. Everything is controlled by finance. It is the only distinguishing differentiator between people that still exists in our egalitarian society. Also, the envy and even hatred felt towards those who possess wealth by those who do not. How could men to whom egalitarian theories have been preached fail to revolt when they see all around them inequality in the most material order of things, the order to which they are bound to be most sensitive? It drives every aspect of our society, from our politics to our occupations and fears to our daily grind at work. We are being led by democracy through material materialist propaganda toward the ever-elusive idea of progress. And as we continue, driven by more and more accumulation, things speed up. We discover new things. We have more technological breakthroughs. We invent new things that help us accumulate faster. And the combination of these findings begin to compound and catapult us into more and more progress that is seemingly never ending. But as we move faster and faster into the future, we are not taking the time to consider anything anymore, and it becomes increasingly harder to slow down. How do these technologies affect our lives, our minds, and the future of humanity? The goal is purely mathematical and materialistic. It has no time for reflection. Its goal is to overindulge on information and bring forth a technological future that no man could have ever dreamed of for the sake of more and more accumulation of material things. And the question we ultimately have to ask ourselves is it worth it? All this progress, the loss of our spirituality, the loss of our intellect, the loss of our ability to contemplate and reflect, to slow down and give our whole lives to something greater, to recognize transcendent and sublime beauty. Progress has obviously had many advantages, don't get me wrong, but we must ask ourselves if what we are sacrificing for those things is ultimately worth it. We have to wonder at the fact that we have now in our time conveniences and luxuries that mankind in no other age could have ever imagined, that have been made available to everyone worldwide, yet we are more unhappy than ever before. The more that we accumulate, the more that we feel that we are lacking. The modern world has created for us a sea of unnecessary needs that, when satiated, give us temporary and fleeting bouts of happiness. Even sex has been brought down to this level where it lacks any higher principle and is merely another material industry, so that sexual desires, like any other desire, can be satiated with the click of a button on the computer. We wonder, what is love? Because we are blinded by materialism and unable to see transcendent principles. We work to obtain money because it is through this means that we obtain our material satisfactions. And the more that we accumulate, the more that we want, and the more that we are told that we need. This monstrous cycle is absorbing us entirely, manufacturing our never-ending pursuit of happiness in this life through material means that never actually satiate the true longing of our souls for the eternal. Despite this gloomy outlook, Guenon offers a glimmer of hope and a potential way out: reform. Guénon's exact idea of reform, though, is a sort of esoteric and universalist idea of tradition that he sees as alive in the East and dead in the West. This is where I don't see eye to eye with Guénon. I sympathize with his hope later on in the book that Catholicism could potentially bring back a sacred order to the world, but as he admits, these modern ideas have poisoned the minds of most Christians in both the Catholic Church and in Protestantism. And I personally believe that the Reformers' intention was the same of Guénon. Despite their caricatures as such, the Reformers were not revolutionaries. They were traditionalists. They wished to reform the Catholic Church to a more traditional form of Christianity. All I can say is, in the face of this crisis that Guénon wrote about and that most of us are now waking up to, our only hope is in Christ. And despite what happens in this world, we must hold on to Him. Our reaction to the time should not be conforming to the world, but conforming to Christ by the inward working of the Holy Spirit. As Nietzsche canvassed for us in The Gay Science with the parable of the madman, the Enlightenment effectively killed the cultural idea of God in the Western world and threw us into the abyss of a secular world, where all things are unbound from their eternal and transcendent foundation. The world has been unchained from its anchor of truth and now floats away with no moral grounding. Our one hope of not being dragged into the abysmal darkness is to cling to the truth with all our being. And with that, I'm gonna end this video. If you liked it or learned something new, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.